Welcome to this program presented today by the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University about the Amichai Windows. The audience is on mute and our speakers will be on the screen. If you have a question for the program, please put it in the chat and I'll be moderating the program, and at the end, I'll pose your questions to our speakers. I'd like to welcome Gary Rensburg, who serves as the Blanche and Irving Laurie Professor of Jewish History and holds the rank of Distinguished Professor in the Department of Jewish Studies here at Rutgers University. His teaching and research focus on all things ancient Israel, primarily language and literature, though also history and archaeology. His secondary interests include ancient Egypt, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew manuscript tradition, and Jewish life in the Middle Ages. He's the author of 7 books and about 200 articles. His most recent book is How the Bible is Written, with particular attention to the use of language to create literature. And soon you'll learn about Professor Rensburg's particular interest and involvement in the Amichai Windows project. I am delighted to welcome Rick Black. He is an award-winning book artist and poet. His artist books are represented in private and public collections, including the Library of Congress, Yale University, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. A journalist for many years, Mr. Black worked overseas for 3 years in the Jerusalem Bureau of the New York Times. While he enjoyed reporting, he was intent on pursuing his love of literature and books. After studying at the Center for Book Arts in New York City, he founded his own imprint, Turtle Light Press, which specializes in artist books and prints, haiku titles, and digital photography. Most of us probably aren't familiar with and don't know what an artist book is. And that is something I'm really excited about everyone learning about today. It's a really unusual and just beautiful art form. Rick Black completed the Amichai Windows, a 10-year project of translation, research, design, letterpress, and hand bookbinding, with a collection of 18 poems by Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. The Amichai Windows opens a window onto love, war, and being Jewish today. Welcome, Rick, and thank you so much, Gary, for interviewing Rick and moderating today's program.
Thank you very much, Karen. Welcome, everyone. Hello, Rick.
Hello, Gary.
It's great to be together on this absolutely wonderful program. We begin with a poem.
ילדתי הקטנה מסתכלת.
My Little Girl Looks, a poem by Yehuda Amichai.
ילדתי הקטנה מסתכלת לתוך עיניי, כמו לתוך חלונות של בית אבלים אפל, אבל היא רואה בתוכו חתנים וכלות מתכוננים לטקס.
My little girl looks into my eyes, as if into windows of a dark house of mourning, but she sees within it brides and grooms preparing for the ceremony.
ילדה קטנה, מלאת מזון, כלי גדוש אושר, שק מתוק.
A little girl full of food, a vessel brimming with happiness, a sweet bundle.
האהבה הרבה ששמים על ידה בשנתה, לא מכבידה עליה, להפך, היא נעשית קלה יותר ויותר.
The great love that is put on a girl in her sleep does not weigh her down. To the contrary, she grows lighter and lighter.
סימן הלידה הקטן יזכיר לה גם שנים אחר מותי, שנולדה לאביה יהודה ולאמה חנה ביום קיץ יפה.
The small birthmark will remind her even years after my death that she was born to her father Yehuda and to her mother Hannah on a beautiful summer day. That was just one of the 18 poems which Rick Black has included in his wonderful art book, about which you will learn so much more today, Chalonot Amichai, the Amichai Windows. 18 poems by Yehuda Amichai, the noted Israeli poet, all of which were specifically selected by Rick Black for this incredible project, this artist book. To give you a sense of what the project is all about and what an artist book means, we share with you here this short video of the production of the book. And as you watch the video, notice Rick's hand to gain a sense of the size, the actual size of the book, which will be much, much larger, as you would imagine when you hear the word book, something you hold in your hands. Let's go to that video now. Thank you. Hopefully I gave you a sense of what an art book is, but we'll be exploring that topic naturally with the book's producer, Rick, in just a moment. I thought we would begin by giving you just a little background for those of you who are not aware of the remarkable life and career of Yehuda Amichai. Amichai was born in Würzburg, Germany, 1924. He and his family moved to Mandate, Palestine in 1935. Amichai served in both the British Army during World War II and in the Palmach division of the Haganah during the Israeli War of Independence in 1948. He then went on to have an illustrious career as a poet and clearly ranks as one of the greatest modern Hebrew poets of the past century. Rick, before we get into Amichai's poetry, tell us how and when you first heard about artist books, and please let us know what exactly is an artist book for those who are new to the entire genre.
Sure. First, I just want to thank Karen, yourself, and the Bildner Center for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be able to share my work with you and everyone listening in. I was living in Highland Park, New Jersey at the time, right near Rutgers, and that's how we met. And I went into New York City. I don't remember why, but I was on my way back to the Penn Station to catch the train home. And on my way back, I went down, I think it was 27th Street in New York. I see this big banner hanging over the street, Center for Book Arts. It's like Center for Book Arts. What the heck is that? So I had some time, so I went inside and went up in the elevator, and the doors, it's like they just opened onto another world. They had these huge guillotine paper cutters. When I say huge, I mean like, 5, 6 feet by 5 or 6 feet each. And, these old Vandercook printing presses and book presses and books in all various stages of being made or taken apart. And then they also had a small exhibition area with some gorgeous artist books that I had never seen or heard of before, as well as some broadsheets, beautiful poems that were laid out with some illustrations. And so I fell in love, really. I loved literature for many years, since my late teens, early 20s, and had always wanted to work with my hands. And so it's like, okay, I got books, I got literature, I got actually making, a book or something like that. And so that's how I found out about artist books. And I started taking all kinds of classes, bookbinding, miniature books, Japanese books, and it really was great. And I'd say about 2 or 3 years after that, I founded my press. It was 2005 at the time, Turtle Light Press, and started making my own. So you ask, what is an artist book? And indeed, most people have no idea, and I had no idea myself. There are all kinds of artist books. There are, in fact, wearable artist books. There are edible artist books. It has a wide range, but for our purposes here today, I would say it's a work of art in the form of a book. Artists who are using various aspects of the book structure to create a work of art. And, it's not like, you order a book from Amazon or Barnes and Noble, and, those are primarily text dominated with, sequential pages and a spine binding to left-hand side, a codex binding. But an artist book is quite different. Some have words, some don't have any words at all. Some have a binding, some have like a codex binding, others don't have any binding, or they have a secret Belgium binding or a Coptic binding. They come in different shapes, a carousel book, a tunnel book, dos-a-do. It's really very wide ranging. The main thing for me with an artist book is that there be a unifying idea and something that holds the book together. I love artist books that are intricate, intimate, and interactive. Those are 3 factors that I really love about artist books. And so what do I like to merge form and function together in my artist book. So what does that mean? It means I want the form to mirror the content, to be integral to the subject and add to its emotional effect.
And those 3 words that you just used, intimate, intricate, and interactive, I think the audience can see that over my shoulder is a copy of the book. It's absolutely beautiful, and having experienced it exactly as you've just described it, it just is everything that you've just said and more. It's textured and tactile, and of course the poetry of Amichai, which we'll get to in just a second. And later in our program, we'll actually show you a few images of Rick at work. So when he talks about working with his hands, we'll see some photos of him actually producing the book, so you'll get a sense of that as well. And now let's talk about Yehuda Amichai. I know that you met the great poet and that you remain in touch with his widow, Chana. Share with our audience some of the stories. How did you get to know Amichai? And that's the other half of this project and how all of that emerged.
Sure. Let me backtrack a little bit. As Karen had mentioned, I was a reporter actually for many years, and and also turned to poetry. So I come to the book arts from the writing end as opposed to the visual arts. I lived in Israel for 6 years. The first 3 years, I was studying Hebrew literature at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And the second 3 years, I was working as a reporter, first for Associated Press and then for the New York Times. And those were, I mean, it's always difficult. Life in Israel is difficult. Those were, I think, especially difficult. Those were the days of the first Palestinian Intifada and the first Persian Gulf War. And so every day there were demonstrations and, live ammunition being fired, rubber bullets, Molotov cocktails, you name it, and people being killed on both sides. And what got me the most was when, a Palestinian woman would be killed. She's up hanging laundry and she's shot and killed by soldiers, and vice versa. I'd have to go out and cover a terrorist plunges an Egged bus off the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway into a cliff, and so many people are killed, or a Holocaust survivor is killed in a terrorist attack at a bus stop. It's like one horror after another that I had to deal with. And then the Persian Gulf War came after that, and that was something that I never thought I would experience, carrying a gas mask around. They came in these little cardboard boxes with a strap, so it's kind of like carrying, your lunchbox everywhere in Jerusalem, which was so ironic to me, it being, symbolic, seemingly the city of peace. So eventually I came back to the States, and I freelanced for a while as a reporter, but that has its ups and downs. And eventually I took a job with the Israeli consulate in Philadelphia as their press liaison. And that's actually how I met Yehuda Amichai, not in Israel. We were doing a conference for young American Jews, and we invited Yehuda in to be the keynote speaker to do a poetry reading. So I was assigned to escort him around the city and all that kind of stuff. So I went down to the 30th Street station at Penn Station in Philadelphia to greet him and his wife, Hannah. And they're coming up from the train platform, and he's schlepping this, huge beat up suitcase up the stairs. So I go down the stairs a little bit, I say, Yehuda, let me help you. And he said, no, kol echad tzarich lischov et shelo. No, everybody has to schlep their own bags, So he hits me right away with a metaphor, and that's what it was like the whole weekend with him. He just, he was just very down to earth, very approachable, very warm, and so we hit it off really right away. So that's when I first met, and only time that I was with Yehuda.
What a great story, and what a great. That just encapsulates his entire life. Schlepping a piece of luggage becomes a poetic metaphor for everyone. That's really wonderful. And Hannah, you're still in touch with his widow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
Very much so.
Right. Great. Okay. And she lives in Jerusalem.
Right.
And now bring the two together. So you have this interest in book arts, and you have an interest in Amichai's poetry. And then you merge them in the project that we are discussing today, the Amichai Windows. Tell us, a light bulb went off at some point. When did these two parts of your life come together here?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I knew nothing about book art when I met him, but I had always loved his poetry. I don't remember exactly when I started reading his work, but it hit a deep chord in me. from early on. And if you ask me, well, what do you like in particular so much about Amichai's poetry? I would say the first thing that I really love is his humor and his irony. He has this very dry sense of irony. Even in the most difficult situations, he uses humor to deal with it. So that's one thing. The other thing that I really love is the way in which he plays with Jewish tradition and the Bible. You have these expectations, if you know the prayers or you know the biblical stories, that it's going to go a certain way. But then Amichai comes in and he changes the prayers, or he'll change the story, and that creates this wonderful dynamic, a certain irony and humor to kind of get his points across. So I love that playful sense. But the third thing that I particularly love about his work is the way in which he wrestles with God, or with the idea of God, and how God is or isn't involved in human history. Especially after all the things that I had seen in Israel as a reporter, and even beforehand in my own personal life, I had plenty of doubts and was wrestling with this myself. So I love the way in which he does that in his poetry. But even more than all that, when I spent time with him in Philly, he really spoke to me like a father. After the reading, we went back to his hotel, and I was telling him a little bit about my experiences as a war reporter in Israel, and that I was writing. I turned to poetry also to deal with that, because you need to find a way to deal with that emotional toll, right? You don't just report on all that stuff every day and it doesn't have an effect on you. It's like, what do you do with that? So I needed to find a release, and this is what he said to me. He said, Rick, he said, love won't save you from war, but it can help you deal with the pain. He said, poetry can help too. Words helped me to regain balance in my life. You have to accept life on its own terms. If you try to fight it, you'll break.
Wow.
So those are the reasons why I really wanted to do his poetry.
That's so beautiful, and this work truly is an homage to the great poet. And by the way, we will conclude our program this later, towards the end, towards 1 o'clock. We'll conclude with another one of Amichai's poems. We're going to read one right now, but the third poem that we'll be reading at the end of the program is actually right on that very issue of God's role in our lives and so on, and how Amichai expressed that in that beautiful poem. So that's coming attractions. We'll get to that. But as long as we are here, let's actually read another one of his poems, a very short poem. Rick.
Chalon Tamid.
Eternal Window, a poem by Yehuda Amichai.
בתוך גן שמעתי פעם שיר או ברכה ישנה.
Within a garden, I once heard a song or an old blessing.
ומעל העצים האפלים חלון תמיד מואר.
And above the dark trees, an eternal window is always lit.
לזכר הפנים שהיו בו, שגם הם זכר חלון מואר אחר.
In memory of the faces that were in it, themselves a memory of another lit window. Wow, beautiful. And here is the spread. We'll use this word spread. The entire book, as you see behind me, is in triptych form. And each one of these, what do you call these, spreads or sleeves, or that come out, pages, and they're also in triptych form. And here you have the poem we just read, Eternal Window. So let's actually look at some of this more closely, Rick. Who are these people, and why did you choose these photos? And And in fact, in a larger way, and of course the word chalon, windows, in the title of this poem, how did you settle on windows as the overall theme for the book?
Yeah. Well, actually, after I decided that I wanted to do a book of Yehuda's poems, I wrote to Hannah. Yehuda was already gone. He died in 2000, and this was like 2006. And so I was in touch with Hannah, and I said I'd like to do an artist book of his work, and she said, okay. And so I looked and found a bunch of poems that I liked that all had to do with family. You know, a lot of times Yehuda writes about not necessarily his father, but father, mother, children, stuff like that. And so I said to Hannah, that's what I wanted to do. And she said, no. What do you mean, no? And she says, well, if you do that, people are going to interpret the poems too literally. They'll think that the father in the poem is Yehuda's father and the mother like that, Yehuda's mother, and it's not necessarily so. So I was disappointed, but I said, all right, I have to respect her wishes, but it turned out to be the best thing that happened. So I went back to the drawing board and I started to read through, I don't know, hundreds of his poems. And I found this one 6-line poem, Chalon Tamid. And as soon as I read it, I knew that was it. That was the idea. So the first thing that I particularly loved was the title, Chalon Tamid. So he's playing here. Usually in the Jewish tradition, it's Ner Tamid, an eternal candle, right? And that's reminiscent. In the front of every synagogue, there's a light that's supposed to be like an eternal light that was in the temple, the ancient temple, and kind of symbolically of God's light escorting the Israelites out of Egypt.
Which everybody can see very front and center at the top of this page right here.
Right.
Synagogue, Ner Tamid, yes.
But that's not what you were saying. No, Zelo, it's not Ner Tamid, it's Chalon Tamid. It's an eternal window. So I love that humor, but the poem also raises questions about remembering and being remembered, and perhaps memory is our primary window. You know, it raises all these interesting questions. And what I loved was you had a figure or more than one in a window remembering loved ones who were in a window remembering loved ones who were in a window remembering loved ones. And that's what's eternal. That's what kind of keeps going back and back like that. So I loved all those ideas of the poem itself. But then as a book artist, I was looking for something to work with graphically, you know, tactilely, physically, that I could work with. And that's where the idea of windows came in. And it worked metaphorically, it worked symbolically in so many different ways. I mean, you know, a poet's window on the world, ways in which a poem is like a window that you have to open. And in terms of visibility, I could play with what's seen or what's not seen. You know, what you see out your window one time you might not see another time. It's the same thing when you read a poem, right? Each time you read it, you see something different. You have a different understanding of it. So it worked on so many different levels. So then I went back and read through his poems again, looking for window poems, and there actually are quite a few. But so I decided to select 18 of them, which was totally insane. I didn't realize that then in terms of the project. But 18, so in Hebrew, the letters have numerical equivalents, and the 18 is chai, which means life, the Hebrew word for life. But I only selected the poems that hit me emotionally. Those are the ones that I really wanted to work with. There always had to be at least one line in the poem that just kind of, you know, put me away, and that I really loved. So So that's how I got to Windows through this poem.
And these photos that we see here that are included in this spread?
Yeah, the photos, so each spread is a collage that I put together, and it's printed digitally. And then I would take that and without the poems, and then I letterpress the poems on top of that spread. And then I would place the curtain, on top afterwards and do the gold leaf in the thing. So those were all the last parts of it. But so there are images that were collaged. So to get the images, I did a lot of archival research, and I'll just talk about three here, the three pictures of people that you see here. So the one in the middle, her name is Esther, and she was living in Chelm, Poland. She worked in a photography store. And when the Nazis invaded, she and her family fled to the Soviet zone. They were deported to a labor camp, a forced labor camp there. But she fell in love with a Soviet Jewish soldier, and they got married, and they survived the war, and she eventually came to this country. To the bottom right is a pair of Austrian Jewish twins, sisters, and they are in this window, and I love the way they were kind of posed together. Their parents perished in Auschwitz, but they survived the war and also came to this country eventually. But the picture in the upper left has a very special story. That's a picture of a German refugee family by the name of Gerichter. And there's the father, the mother, about a 15-year-old girl to the right, and their dog. They fled to Albania, and they were hidden there by a Muslim family in this one-room house or studio. And they eventually had to flee from one city to another, but they also eventually survived the war. So when I was showing this spread to the librarians and the staff at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, because I wanted to show them what I had done with the pictures, one of the women there says, "Is the name of the girl Johanna?" I said, "Johanna?" I said, "I'm not sure. I think it is." I said, "Let me check the guide." So I made a guide with all the background on the images, introduction and all that. So we checked it. And sure enough, the name of that girl is Johanna Gerichter. And she was just stunned. She said, "She used to work here." I said, "What?" Said, "She was a volunteer here at the museum, and she used to give tours to all the school children who would come in, and she would tell her story, what you just told us, and she would stress to them the importance of tolerance for different people and different religions." So of all the pictures that I picked, that was.
Rick, you've shared stories with me in the past, and I don't remember hearing that story. Just absolutely, wow, how beautiful that. And then, you're right, of thousands, tens of thousands of photos that you could have selected. There she is. So in this poem, we actually have here the poem, very short poem that we just read. We have the original manuscript up on your screen now in Amichai's own handwriting of this Chalon Tamid, eternal window. So Amichai's papers are now housed at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. And Rick, I know you paid a visit there. I just can't imagine how, everything from emotional to fascinating to remarkable to extraordinary such a visit would be. To, you talk about tactile, to hold in your hand the actual papers and see the actual ink and that Amichai wrote as he drafted these poems. So just tell us about that experience of going to the Beinecke.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. I spent 3 days there, and each day I would go into the library and I'd have them deliver a bunch of files to me, just standard looking files, but inside was just all these amazing poems and papers. I found all the original poems that I had wanted to use. But I also was there not just for the poems, but to see if there were photos or images or just things that I could use graphically in the work as well. And it was kind of like looking through a window at Amichai's life, right? Because I found recipes for soup, making soup on Shabbat. He used to like to do that, or pictures of Amichai with his family or with his daughter. I found his call-up notice to the IDF, or I found a picture of him in uniform in the British Army in Cairo. So I found all these things that I, took pictures of and eventually integrated into the work one way or another. But it's hard to describe, what it was like to actually hold his poems in my hands. And I also found some essays and letters that he wrote, and there was one that particularly moved me that I jotted down a few words I want to read for folks. And Amichai wrote, "Poetry is my release. It helps me locate my pain and transform it into words. It helps me sort out the chaos and gives me something to hold on to. Call it meaning if you want." And I just cried.
Well, and when Karen introduced you, we haven't stressed the fact, although you mentioned it yourself, you also write poetry on your own. So this is the poet speaking to the poet. And as long as we have the original up here, we don't have to go into all the details, but just to remind folks that when you have the original manuscript, the original jottings of the poet, you see the crossouts and the changes and slight alterations and so on between the first draft that you see there, the printed version on the left. There's our English translation. So that's what a thrill to actually spend time with Amichai's own material and then to discover something like you just read. This would be a good point to mention to everyone that welcome to the world of artist books. There are only 18 copies of this, right? Rick produced 18 copies, and some of the great collections house the Amichai Windows project now. The Beinecke at Yale has one, the Library of Congress has one, the Holocaust Museum in Washington has one. So these are treasures now which are housed in the greatest of our libraries. Rick, let's return to the actual physical making of the book, or the different stages of making the book. You said you worked on it for 10 years. Before you answer the question, I suppose I should inform everybody, all of our attendees, participants, that I, along with my Rutgers colleague, Azania Dean Israel, had the most minor input into this project. Rick, Azan, and I would meet at one of our local cafes in Highland Park, New Jersey, over the course of a year, working through the translations of the poem. Rick did the draft, and then Azan and I discussed, and translating from one language to another, if you're translating basic prose, it's pretty, it can be challenging, but it's certainly easier. And then you get into the poetry and the nuances. And I just, recall all those wonderful meetings we had. It was just great to work through the poetry. And so that's my own little input into this. But tell us more about making the book. I mean, from beginning to end, it's a 10-year project.
Yeah, well, first of all, you and Azan didn't play such a minor role. The translation was quite important, and it worked out in a way that really couldn't have been better, because I would come up with a draft and we would pull it apart and go over every word, and you tended to be more literal, and you knew a lot of the references in terms of the Hebrew and stuff like that. And Azan, being a native speaker, he knew the slang, and he was more it was freer in terms of his translations. And so I would take everything that you both said and go back to my basement studio, and then wrestle with the words myself, and try and come up with a good translation. But the various stages, well, of course, first come up with the idea, select the poems, and get Hannah's approval. But Hannah only has the English translation rights. She doesn't have the Hebrew reprint rights. So I had to negotiate that with Shak in Tel Aviv. And then, of course, the translation of the poems, the research at Yale, and then just experimenting with different book forms. I didn't necessarily know that I wanted to make it in the final form that you see it. I was experimenting with accordion books, and a lot of my book artist friends, oh, that would be great because you could have flaps and you could see through and different things. But I felt like it was taking away from the primacy of the poems, which I really wanted the reader to be immersed in an intimate way in the poem and the images. So I came up with the triptych idea, which really was my first conception of it. But then, of course, the graphic design, and I would have a schematic idea for each poem, playing off of something in the poem, certain images that hit me, and I would try to build my own metaphors, my own visual metaphors off of Amichai's words and his own metaphors, and so there are certain themes that run through the work. Of course, windows and curtains. There are a lot of curtains that you can lift and see something that I've hidden behind it. I've done a lot of blind embossments in the work, which means running the letterpress without ink, so it makes an imprint in the page of a Jewish star or a bird or whatever it might be that you can only touch, and you can see it, but it's kind of hidden. It's not obvious. And so birds are also a frequent theme in the work in terms of seeking refuge and fleeing from trouble, but also in a positive sense in terms of poetic flight and inspiration. And clock hands, clocks and dislocated clock hands are also Amichai's, kind of to reflect Amichai's sense of time. He had this very contemporaneous sense of past and future all being held within the present moment, and yet being outside of it too, kind of dislocated, and everything being awry like that. So those were some of the things I was integrating in the design. Lots of more archival research besides the Beinecke, the Library of Congress, National Archive of Israel, Holocaust Museum, George Washington University here, many others around the world. Finally finished the graphic design, and then part of the graphic design was choosing the typefaces, and they needed to work together, the Hebrew and the English. And Hebrew, as you know, is kind of blocky or square, whereas English is more flowing around. So I wanted the typefaces to work together like that. And then I had to prepare them. So letterpress is done, letter by letter with lead type. But one, I didn't have Hebrew type, and two, I could never have set this by hand, letter by letter. I would be dead. I mean, it's just impossible.
Including the vowels.
Yeah, right. So there's something called a photopolymer plate, which is it's flexible, and it can be adhered to a base on the press. And so I prepare the words or images that I want to make on the computer, then I ship that off, and they make basically a plastic plate that I then can use on the old-fashioned press. So I had to prep all the plates, and then of course letterpress the poems, and then cut down the individual sheets and fold and attach everything. And that were basically the different stages.
And again, we'll be showing some of that in a little bit, and just staggering when you start talking about the intricate work that's involved. Let's just quickly show a few of the we'll look at one of them in great detail in a moment, but just to give people a sense again of each of these. And first of all, you can see the book behind me still, of course, and the images that you see here. I guess we should just make the obvious comment, you know, in a North American context, we hear the word window and things slide up and down, of course, but your triptych design evokes the sort of the way windows close in Mediterranean countries and in the Middle East, right? They open and close in that, you know, the shutters and all that. And, you know, even in other parts of Europe. So I you know, all the other options that you may have considered, the accordion book and this book and that book, the triptych design really just captures what you described earlier as the window within the window. This poem, Yom Kippur, and I love the medieval Machzor manuscript that you include there. You see the big letters, Melech, of course, one of the themes of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the kingship of God, and synagogue. This one, the English title, Summer Evening by a Window with Psalms. Just beautiful. Yad Elohim Ba'olam, God's hand in the world, which we touched upon earlier, and we'll be concluding the program with this very poem. And this one we'll spend some more time on. This is one of Amichai's longer poems, HaYehudim, the Jews. And as Rick pointed out to me, we'll talk about it now in greater detail. It's the one poem of the 18 that is presented vertically here, not the horizontal opening, but as everybody can see, the vertical one. So here's the entire spread, and let's begin to look at some of these images which are incorporated. Upper right-hand corner, if people can see it, let's look at this. Rick, tell us about this.
So this is a poem which is about the Shoah, and this particular picture is of a Jewish-owned store in Berlin with anti-Semitic graffiti written in the windows. Can you read the German, Gary? Can you see it?
Yeah, I mean the little one on the right says every mark which is in Jewish hands, mark meaning the currency, every mark which is in Jewish hands is a loss to the German fatherland. One on the left says that if you deal with Jews, right, why should you do such a thing when there's such unemployment all over Germany? I'm paraphrasing, but these are little rhyme verses. Both of these little signs there rhyme. And Lemberg, I assume, on the left window must be the name of the family, and you see the word Judah, Jew, on the right there. So
yeah. So if you go back or ahead, I'm not sure where in the.
There we go. Yeah.
So that picture, that photo, is in the upper right-hand corner of the spread. I think there's a close-up later on that you would see it better. So
let's see. We'll get to it, I guess. Yeah.
And then I found this incredible etching by Hermann Struck of this old Jew just looking out. And if you see this whitish arc on the bottom of the picture is where I photoshopped out some of the color so that it would actually work in the collage when it was all put together. And here's a close-up of it. So you can see part of Lemberg, you can see part of the photograph of the store in the upper right. You can see the old Jew as if he's looking at all of this, right? That was the idea, was he's kind of gazing at all of, what's happening in terms of Jewish history. And then I made a plate of some Jerusalem windows with the arced window like that and the shutters. And I embossed that onto the spread. And this picture of the store itself, you can see a chai blind embossed in the window. So I blind embossed a chai in every one of the 18 spreads, and I did that on one hand because of Amichai's kind of playful nature, so I thought it would be fun that I would hide it in various places and people would have to try and find it. But I also did it because Chai is the last part of Amichai's name, right? It was like my tribute to him. But also, I put it here, Dafka in this window with anti-Semitic graffiti, it's like, okay, here, we're still alive, we're still here.
And there's the whole spread again. That's the upper half of the spread that we've just talked about. And
right.
We actually now get into something, of course, that I'm interested in, as Karen mentioned in the introduction. The lower half, if everybody can notice, is the one of the Dead Sea Scrolls caves at Qumran. So here is a photo of that, and then Rick includes it. Let me go back right there at the bottom. But of course, using his artistic talent, tell us some more about Herman Struck lithographs.
Well, all of this, we don't have time to read the Jews. It's quite a long poem, but all of this is kind of riffing off of Amichai's poem, in which at one point he talks about the Jews as being not an archaeological people, but a geological people with all kinds of lava and eruptions and flows and everything. So I incorporated those lithographs into the rock itself of the Qumran caves by the Dead Sea. So here's another dove. I was talking about birds being a symbol, a motif that I hid inside one of the caves. And you can see in the bottom right, there's another one of the lithographs of a young boy or young man. And then in the whole thing, there's a curtain to the middle right. Go back, Gary.
Yeah.
Go back. Go back. Yeah, there's a curtain with a menorah on it. So when you lift that curtain, there's another person hidden behind there. And then the poem was long, so I had to do something special with the poem itself. So in tribute to all the burned books and Torah scrolls and everything, what I did was I burned the edges of each of these pieces of paper. It's a special bark. It's a soft paper. It's paper made from bark in Mexico. And I went around the edges of each one and occasionally even burned holes in the paper itself as a kind of a tribute to those books.
Yeah, just, well, so evocative of Amichai and what he's trying to convey there, of course, in that poem, HaYehudim, the Jews. So this is what you were referring to earlier. We're now into some parts of the actual physical bookmaking. You mentioned the photopolymer plates.
Right.
This is what you're referring to, and these can get
upgraded. Those will get placed on the press,
right,
one at a time, obviously, when I'm making, and I have to set it exactly where I want it to hit on the paper. And letterpress, the Vandercook printing press, you see 0.918 in the upper left-hand corner. That's the height at which the press has to hit the bed, right? The cylinders of the press have to hit the bed with the paper to get a good print. And if it's 0.917 or if it's 0.919, you're out of luck. It has to be exact.
Well, precision is the word. I mean, here's Rick at work, as you can see. And the equipment that the artist uses in making book art. Let's show another example. Oh, this. It must have been a thrill. I mean, here it is, right off the press. Emotions when this happened, 10 years before.
Hard to believe.
Hard to believe. So you can see your smile there and just holding it up so proudly and happily as you should be, of course. And so much more work to be done in producing a book of this sort. And I feel we need another word in English. I mean, we could say the word art book or artist book, but the word book just doesn't do it. We need some new term in the English language for everything that you produced here in this incredible project, Chalonot Amichai. We will read one more poem, but to close. But before we do, I just want to note in the bottom right there, you see that there's an introduction by Robert Alter. This is the booklet that comes with the Amichai Windows project. You can see the book behind me again opened up. So on that one part of the book where the booklet is missing, it goes in between those ribbons. So it comes with this. And in this is all sorts of explanations from Rick, but also an introduction to the project by our colleague Robert Alter, the great professor of comparative literature and Hebrew literature, both ancient and modern, at UC Berkeley. So that was another aspect of the book project that we should acknowledge here.
Gary, let me just mention, Rick, I believe there's a digital version of the guide available, right?
There is.
Okay.
Yeah, there is.
I was just about to post it. Somebody else posted it here.
Oh, good, good.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so there is a digital version of that people can look for.
Good. And let's close with one final poem. It's the one that we've alluded to several times here, God's Hand in the World. But we'll mix it up a little bit, and this time I'll read the Hebrew and Rick will read the English. And then we'll take all of your questions. We have plenty of time for all the Q&A. Yad Elohim Ba'olam.
God's Hand in the World, a poem by Yehuda Amichai.
Yad Elohim Ba'olam, ki yad imi bim'i hatarnagol hashachut, be'erev Shabbat. Ma roeh Elohim me'ever lachalon, be'et yadav netunot ba'olam, ma roah imi.
God's hand in the world is like my mother's hand in the entrails of the slaughtered chicken on Sabbath Eve. What does God see through the window while his hands are in the world? What does my mother see?
Ke'evi kvar sav, yalad shnei dorot, shel ke'evim hadomim lo. Tikvotai hikimu shikunim levanim, archek min hadochak shebi.
My pain is already a grandfather. It has sired 2 generations of pains that resemble it. My hopes have put up white housing projects far from the tumult inside me.
Na'arati shachacha et ahavata al hamidracha, kumo ofanayim, kol halayla bachutz uvatal.
My girlfriend forgot her love on the sidewalk like a bicycle, all night outside and in the dew.
Yiladim roshmim et toldot chayai, ve'et toldot Yerushalayim, b'gir yareach al hakvish, Yad Elohim Ba'olam.
Children record the history of my life and the history of Jerusalem with moon chalk on the street. God's hand in the world.
And we could spend hours analyzing every line of every one of these poems and the word choices and the messages and the meanings and the layers of meanings. Really just a remarkable project. And thank you, Rick, for sharing it with us today. We have time for Q&A, and I know Karen in the control booth, we'll call it, is going to start sending us questions. So thank you, Rick. There you have the beautiful Chalonot Amichai website information and Rick's email if anyone wants to get in touch with him offline. Karen.
Well, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And I have to say, when Rick first came to Rutgers and showed me the finished book, and he came in a little rolling suitcase and took it out wearing his white gloves and presented it on the table, I was so wowed by it. And I couldn't quite see how we would present it in one of our usual large public programs, because we're usually in a large lecture room with a lot of people sitting far away from the speaker. So I'm just thrilled that we had this opportunity to bring Rick and his work, and of course, Gary and your special insight in this more far away, distant, but yet intimate way that we could see the work. So thank you so much. There were a lot of very specific questions about the paper and the ink type and the typeface and bookbinding. And I'm going to suggest that those folks perhaps write to you directly. I know we had another print artist on, we had another poet on. But let me ask one of the questions, which is your recommendations for translations of Amichai's published poetry that you would recommend. Somebody asked, are there particular books of poetry translated into English that you would recommend?
Well, the most recent and probably comprehensive is one that was actually published by Robert Alter, and he has amassed together various translators and their versions of the poems, and he has also published some of his own translations in that work. I think it's simply called The Poetry of Yehuda Amichai by Robert Alter. There's a really good anthology which has there's Amichai's most incredible book to me is Open, Closed, Open was the last work that he did. And that was translated by Chana Bloch and Chana Kronfeld, a wonderful version. And there's also an anthology that was done that I like, a selection of from various periods of Yehuda's life. And that was by Chana Bloch and Stephen Mitchell, who's a terrific translator also.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I also have a question, and I think Gary and I had this question too, about what's your next project? So could you talk a little bit about Turtle Light Press and what kinds of work is coming out of Turtle Light, and what's the next thing that you're working on?
Sure. Well, the next artist book that I'm working on is Akedah. It's on the biblical story of the binding of Isaac. And it will be, I just loved all of it's this foundational story for Judaism, right? And it's so weighted and so difficult a text to grapple with. And I love all the voices, but also the silences, the gaps in the text. And so it's going to be a kind of typographical interpretation of that story in terms of letterpress and words and letters, again in Hebrew and English. So that's the next up on the drawing board, and I hope to finish it within a year from now. I've been working on it off and on for the past 2 years, I'd say. Wow. Not another 10-year project.
Glad to hear that.
So that's the main in terms of artist books. As far as Turtle Light Press goes, I do a lot of different things. These artist books, they cost a lot of money to make, and they cost a lot of money to buy, but they cost even more money to make. And so basically whatever I make from Turtle Light Press goes into these artist books. And so I do much more modest poetry books. I do a lot of photography where I turn pictures into photographs, and those are used. Some of them are in hotels, others are in restaurants. People have their houses done, just stuff like that. I have a love of haiku poetry. I've done a lot of haiku poems, stuff like that. I do Japanese ink painting, sumi.
I have one hanging in my room. Yeah, wonderful.
And I think we should point out that when we say paper, people hear the word paper, it's just another ream that you bought at the supply store. We're talking about the highest quality paper. So when we talk about the tactile that we referred to before, and everything else that Rick was just talking about, the studio I mean, this is, we don't have
I
enough
mean,
words. We don't have enough words in English. We say book and paper, right? We need real other words. You know, we're talking about.
if you want to talk about, so there's two, aside from the enclosure itself, which are totally different cost and production and design and everything. But if you're just talking about the paper, so there's two papers. There's an exterior paper, which is handmade primarily from abaco with a little bit of cotton. What I loved about it was this deep decal that goes all the way around the edges there. And so that's very rough in texture. And then the interior paper is like velvet. And that's made in Japan. And that is specially treated for digital print. It needed to be something that could be good for digital printing, for letterpress printing, and for folding, for gold leaf. It took a long time to figure out which papers to use. But I love the contrast between the two, right? The roughness and the softness. And in one of Yehuda's last interviews, before he passed away, the interviewer said, you know, a lot of people criticize your work, a lot. Some people criticize your work that it's too soft. And he said to her, well, you know, life in Israel in particular is not easy. It's rough and it's harsh. And so I purposely inject softness into my poems and into my poetry. And I wanted to reflect that dynamic in the actual papers themselves.
Wow. Well, it's so wonderful to get not only a glimpse of the book and listen to the poetries, but to hear your insight into Yehuda Amichai's work and the background and really all this behind the scenes. And we really can't thank you enough
Thanks
for putting together the video. Right?
Yeah, well, when we talked, you asked me, you know, it's like, how could we give people a sense of actually interacting with the work? And I said, well, you know, I've been thinking about that. And I had seen one other book artist who had done a video of her work. Her name escapes me right now, but in describing it, she talked about the choreography of the book. And I love that phrase.
Right.
I thought, you know, how could I give people a sense of that interaction? And so for the past 2 weeks, that's what I was doing, was trying to make the video that we showed at the beginning. And what I want to do with that is expand it a little bit to include even more. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. You know, Gary, you mentioned it's a very limited edition. It's only 18 copies, and it is accessible in these libraries. And I want it to be in other libraries and more accessible to students and the public so they can interact with it. But I would love to do, you know, how do I share it with people, right? That's the question. And so through programs like this, or, you know, once the pandemic ends, you know, an exhibition in a gallery or a JCC, a gallery or something would be terrific. There are individual spreads. I had a few extra artist proofs that are available for purchase if people want through my Turtle Eye Press website. You can buy just one of the spreads as opposed to the entire work. But I'm also planning on doing, I don't want to say a trade edition, but a popular edition that would be inspired by this work, that would be, you know, something that you could buy through Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever it is. So that's the plan. We'll see. Right. We'll see how we can do it.
Make it more accessible, right? Well, yeah. I recommend to everyone to check out the website, amichaiwindows.com, and you can see an 8-minute video there that also shows a little bit more about Rick's work and about the poetry. I'll play the beginning video again as we end. I just want to say thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us. The next program, sponsored by the Bildner Center, is on April 12th with one of our own professors, Jeffrey Chandler, who will be speaking about his new book, Yiddish, Biography of a Language. We're very excited to hear about that and to have Professor Chandler here with us. on the Zoom. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day. I'm going to share the video again. Now that you've heard about the project, perhaps seeing it again will have a bit of a different meaning. So I'll share that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day. Well, thank you again. I know there's still a few people on there. They're going off, but Gary, if you're still there,
Yeah.
I have to tell you the small world story. And if other people want to listen, that's fine. When I first saw the book, or actually second time I heard Rick talk about the book, and he told the story about Joanna, the little girl in the window picture, right in the spread.
Right.
I had this flash to Joanna because I have met her also. We showed a film in the Jewish Film Festival called Besa, and Joanna was in the film. It was about Jews being rescued in Albania, and she came and spoke at the film festival. So when we talk about a small world experience.
Well, my connection to this, I have no recollection of our showing base at the film festival. So I don't know if you met Rebecca Shannon, Karen?
No, I don't think so.
So Rick, last year I was the mentor to a senior honors thesis in the SAS honors program by Rebecca Shannon. And her grandfather was a survivor in hiding in Poland mainly, but she did her project, the senior honors project was on the Albanian rescue of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
So now I have to go ask her, and she used a little bit out of the BESA, but she did her own project. I now have to go ask her if she knows about this Joanna. Is she still alive?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Joanna?
Joanna. She was a volunteer. She's not.
No, okay, yeah.
I'm thinking that we showed that film maybe eight to 10 years ago. I'm not exactly sure. And she came and spoke, and wonderful. I mean, it was a really wonderful program. So to have these small world connections, it was.
I probably know who so Rebecca used the archives of the Visual History Archive. She did a lot of that. She found everybody who went through Albania who was in the archive, you know, the Spielberg archive, Rick, that we're talking about, of all the survivors and other people involved in the Shoah. And she interwove them into this beautiful I don't know, 45-minute documentary. That was her senior honors project. And
Right.
she told the narrative. She told the whole story. Joanna sounds familiar now. I'll have to go back and look at it.
I
Okay.
know, so many small world connections.
Right.
Yes, right.
So,
All right, well, thank you again, both of you. I thought it was terrific.
Thanks. Great.
thanks so much.
Thank
Rick.
you both. Thanks, Karen.
So great to present. Okay.
Hi, Rick, I'll send you the text from the chat. There are a lot of people that said hello.
Oh, please.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, I'll send it to you.
Great.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you both.
Good night.
bye-bye.